What's up, everybody? John the Morgile here, checking in for a brand new video for ya. Hope you do enjoy it. So welcome to another installment of exploring the historical narrative. It's way more fun than it sounds, trust me. Okay, but we're going to delve into architectural and engineering accomplishments which seem to be a bit beyond the capabilities of even modern construction techniques, let alone the primitive methods of antiquated or even ancient cultures. How was it so practical for the ancients to build their structures using stones so large they're often completely unmanageable, even with top-of-the-line modern cranes? Often using a method of so-called asymmetrical stonework, which frankly baffles anyone familiar with building things. Like, how did they do this so well? It's one thing to cut giant, super heavy stones into neat little square blocks of identical dimensions. Sure, it would be time-consuming and hard work, but it seems logical to build your structure with blocks that'll fit in the wall anywhere. Like Legos, practical stuff. But when you start getting into the exotic designs of the stone walls in ancient sites like at Machu Picchu, which seem to use no two stones of similar dimensions, yet somehow manage to fit all the blocks together so snug that the joints are basically still waterproof after about 1,000 years. If you're not familiar with modern building practices, it is worth mentioning that everything is made to be as light, as manageable, as simplex, like idiot-proof, and as cheap as possible. And, construction materials certainly, you can't call them cheap, but they do make them as affordable as possible. Bricks, for example, are small enough for a regular dude to pick up and manage pretty easily, pretty quickly, maybe juggle them around. Of course, cinder blocks are a bit larger, but really, as far as most construction sites go, cinder blocks are about as big as you're going to get in terms of building blocks, and in most cases today. Now, could you imagine doing a job where you're trying to build a wall from blocks that each weigh like a couple tons? No two blocks are the same, and there's only one possible order in which you can place the blocks and have them complete the wall. Instead of just building a wall, you've now created a very complex Rubik's Cube of sorts out of this project. So in modern times, the man who came up with this plan would be fired, no doubt. And this isn't even considering the amount of meticulous effort which must have been spent on just cutting the stones into the asymmetrical shapes that you find in these ancient walls. So I got to tell you, that would be an absolute nightmare to any builder. Any modern builder would say, no, let's just make the blocks square. They're not gonna go do that, dude. It doesn't make any sense to do that. Frankly, you're really just creating way more problems, way more work than would seem practical to any modern builder using such complex methods as did the ancients. So how were the ancients able to expend such time and planning and resources on something as simple as a wall? Is it possible that these ancient master builders were in possession of some technique or some technology which enabled them to achieve such feats of engineering, incorporating intricate designs, laser-accurate joints and cuts, and overall longevity of these ancient sites like Angkor and Machu Picchu? Or is it possible they were just very lucky at building shit? I doubt the last one. So it appears that the ancients were equipped with a variety of machines which have somehow been lost to history, although the architectural achievements that they have left the world are bold testaments of this claim. For example, if you're hiking through the woods and you find a DVD player laying on the ground, surely we could assume that this DVD player was manufactured somewhere else with some very high-tech gear to make it. I mean, it's not like the thing just materialized out from the vapors on the ground or sprouted forth from a budding lily. So the DVD player is a testament to the technology which created it. So too are the monolithic sites worldwide a testament to the engineering prowess, technology, and advancement of the ancients. Only what happened to them, and what happened to all their tools? So, of course, there are massive, unexplainable, monolithic stone sites all over the world, which are unceremoniously attributed to some local, often primitive culture who, in their records, claim that they have no idea who built these sites. It's just the historians who claim that they built the sites, unbeknownst to the people who have no idea who built it, right? So, oftentimes, cultures who didn't even have the wheel are credited with building things like the Egyptian pyramids, right? Mind-boggling sites like Easter Island were seemingly abandoned by whomever erected the Moai statues at some great expense and effort. Sites like Angkor Wat were evidently evacuated by the pre-Cambodian civilization who built it. Angkor was said to have been built in the 1100s using about 7 million sandstone blocks, and actually modern scholars don't even know how many millions of blocks are in this thing. It says on Wiki anywhere from 5 million to 10 million. So that's about 100% margin of error on that estimate, but we'll meet them in the middle. We'll say about 7 million sandstone blocks, each weighing up to about 1.5 tons each. Some of them were less than that, but the biggest ones of those 7 million some odd blocks were 1.5 tons. That's about 3,000 pounds each. Okay? Now, we're told by Wiki that the extent of these builders' so-called technology involved using elephants to hoist these massive stones onto, get this, bamboo scaffolding. What? Bamboo scaffolding to hold up multi-tons of solid stone. Yeah, that makes sense. The sheer scale of the Angkor Wat complex is sort of hard to wrap your brain around. The moat surrounding the Angkor Wat Temple is just absolutely massive. This moat is over 3 miles long. 3-mile long moat around this thing. And the man-made reservoirs which flank the temple complex on either side completely dwarf the moat. The largest reservoir is about 5 miles long by 2 miles wide. It's like 10 square mile reservoir, and it still holds form nearly 1,000 years later. So you gotta say, even though these guys didn't have any technology, these guys were good. Okay, the amount of manpower needed to build even one of the reservoirs at the Angkor Wat main complex would be easily $100 million project today over the course of a decade. Easily, it would take you 5 or 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars to do one. But for this to be done on the backs of elephants without the use of anything more advanced than some hypothesized pulley systems, which they've never found a trace of, and of course, don't forget your bamboo scaffolding, it's literally unimaginable. Unimaginable. And Angkor is just one example of these sorts of ancient constructions which defy the mainstream narrative. But this one in particular is a beautiful example of how the ancients were absolutely superior builders with better civil engineering capabilities than we have even today. This complex took advantage of the ebb and flow of the natural monsoon waters, which allowed the city to expand over great distances. Now, at some point in the history, scholars can tell that the deteriorating infrastructure of this canal system just deteriorated all the way into disrepair. And essentially what I gather happened is that the flow of the water in the system reversed its direction of what it was supposed to be going. So basically the whole thing was screwed. If your canal system reverses directions, that's not good. So modern engineers are completely duped. They're unable to even understand what's really actually going on in this canal system for the Angkor Wat Temple complex. Certainly they're not able to fix it, let alone understand what's going on with it. And I think that point right there speaks volumes to the comparative capabilities of modern engineers versus ancient engineers. Okay? So the ancients could literally build the Angkor Canal system from scratch, along with the reservoirs and the temple itself, into a beautiful, functioning water delivery system for a vast empire. On the other hand, modern engineers aren't even sure what exactly happened to the system and are at this point unable to go about fixing it. Okay? So the ancient monolithic sites are really, it's an endless source of intrigue and mystery, but, perhaps more intriguing instances of our stolen history can be found in the more recent cathedrals and capitol buildings and World's Fair so-called temporary palaces built from hewn stone permanently, and of course all the insane asylums, which seem to have been built for like royalty or like the people who own royalty, right? I mean, really, what's the point of building a mental institution in the Napa Valley in, say, 1875? Yeah, I mean, it is crazy out there in wine country, but according to the Napa Valley census data, there were only about 7,000 people living in the entire Napa Valley in 1870. By 1880, the data shows a whopping 13,000 total people living in Napa Valley. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy out there in wine country, but according to the Napa Valley census data, there were only about 7,000 people living in the entire Napa Valley in 1870. And by 1880, the same data shows a whopping 13,000 total population of the entire Napa Valley. Now, as I've worked on building schools designed to accommodate, 3,000 students or more, it seems unnecessary to build your nut house with the overkill grandeur and splendor as we see here. Now, I will mention again, we're talking about a school that housed 3,000 students, not a town of 3,000. Of course, the town would have hundreds of thousands of people, but, you want to build a school for 3,000 people in a town of about 100,000, right? But when it comes to building nut houses in the 1800s, man, these guys were literally just all the way off the hook, okay? What purpose does it meet to lock up insane people in just magnificent Gothic castles, built brand new just for them? And boy, are they castles, I'm telling you. According to the Oracle of Truth, Wikipedia, it said that the land site for this nut house was only sold to the state of California in 1872. So within just 3 short years, this monster of a nut house was planned, the ground was graded, and everything was slapped up, no problemo, in just 3 short years. They claim that it was really built as an overflow hospital for another nearby nut house called Stockton Asylum. Now, Stockton wasn't even established as a city until 1850. However, they had their nut house up and ready for Hannibal Lecter the very next year in 1851. Now, it says on Wikipedia that the Stockton Nut House Hospital was overflowing with people reeling from mental problems as a result of, drumroll, the gold rush. Yeah, I'm not even kidding. That's what Wiki says. These people were going crazy from the gold rush. I mean, you know how discovering a bunch of free gold really drives most people bananas, right? Good thing for my local mental asylum. They can take my mind off all this gold. Permanently. Maybe with a lobotomy? Hope not. But seriously, I mean, look at this Napa Valley Asylum, a very convenient 80 miles away to house their overflow. This sprawling Gothic castle was originally built for 500 beds, and now today has over 1,300 patients and over 2,300 employees. According to an article on CA or California.gov, they claim that the hospital was locking up some of their patients under what they call the Welfare and Institutions Code Section 5150. So if you do just a little bit of digging, this was a civil code wherein a designated peace officer or mental health worker can detain and hold patients involuntarily for at least 72 hours against their will, at which point they might decide to keep you in there for longer, maybe forever, and at which point one would probably want to consult with a lawyer to try and get out of there. What's interesting is the fact that the California civil codes were only just implemented in 1872, yet there's articles claiming that this hospital, only just built and created in 1875, was getting a lot of their patients through this basically forced sanitarium. But anyway, the very year that the Napa Hospital was breaking ground, 1872, that's when that 5150 code was passed. So to me, that's just a bit convenient. I mean, it doesn't prove anything, but it's something to keep in the back of your head, because when you have all of these convenient coincidences start to stack up, it does raise some eyebrows. Okay. Now, while I'm unable to find any census data for Stockton, California during the 1800s, it's safe to assume that they couldn't have been drastically higher in population than Napa at the time, which again only had about 7,000 people in the entire valley. So, okay, so what am I getting at here? What's the point? Well, for starters, let's just come out and say it's possible that the information that we're given on places like Wikipedia is not 100% infallible as we'd like to think. Typically, a normal person wouldn't even dream of cross-referencing dates of asylum constructions and populations in that area on Wiki, but, I must say, there is a bit of a red flag here. The biggest one being, of course, the fact that all of the asylums that we've looked at so far were built in areas without many people in them, yet they can rival any French chateau or English castle you can compare them to. So what gives? The narrative which is crafted around such historical locations as these magnificent nut houses never fails to raise an eyebrow. So does it make any sense to build such an elaborate palace to house mental patients suffering from too much gold syndrome of the brain or whatever, according to Wiki? Or is it possible that such structures found all over the country and all over the world were built by a civilization which inhabited this continent at some point prior to the early 1800s? A civilization which has been effectively erased from the modern paradigm. Is it possible that such grandiose feats of engineering were actually existing infrastructures reclaimed and redesignated by a population who was just introduced into the milieu as immigrants, then naturalized citizens, only to be portrayed in our history books as the original founders and builders of these structures? Well, while this may seem far-fetched at first, trust me, I know, the truth is, such a thing is certainly possible, and it makes 1,000,000 times more sense than building luxurious crazy bins for the population of crickets, horse farts, and a few dozen cuckoos from Kalamazoo. When we study the ancient sites like Angkor, it's clear that we're obviously missing large portions of our historical record, and so we have a case of cultural amnesia. When you find even more recent examples of where the quote-unquote facts that were sold by the likes of Wiki don't seem to add up to anything but malarkey, it really makes you wonder. Is it possible for some group of entities in control of the world's levers of power to have effectively erased our history and supplanted the narrative with lies, effectively placing us into a state of cultural amnesia, which we honestly still haven't woken up from to this day? If you know anybody who knows where people come from, I'll give you all the money in the world, okay? Because nobody does. Nobody knows where people come from. Nobody. So if you don't want to call that cultural amnesia, I don't know what you would. In other words, people have no idea what we are or where we actually came from, but we do learn everything that we believe we know from adults who were also once blank slate babies as we are, or as we were, right? So in all actuality, it would not be that difficult to, after some sort of great catastrophe or war or even worldwide flood, could be a lot of things, but some catastrophe, to round up surviving children, place them in orphanages, which orphanages is another one of these things like the asylums, where if you start researching the orphanages and the amount of money and time, it's fishy all over the place. But so it wouldn't be that hard to round up surviving children, place them in orphanages, re-educate them, and ship them into cities with existing infrastructure and a need for fresh bodies. These quote-unquote orphans would be given plausible explanations as to who built the structures that they were inhabiting, but certainly not some grand lost civilization which appears to have been hit by some catastrophe in relatively recent history and also in very ancient history. But okay, why hide the truth about our origins as humans? Why lie about who built this nut house or that one? What is the motive? So that's where this gets a bit speculative, but we certainly do have a decent sketch of the situation after studying this topic for a while. We don't have all the answers. It is obvious to the reasonably astute observer that we're missing some of the pieces to this puzzle, and it also appears that we've been given some extra pieces which clearly don't belong to this picture at all. More and more evidence continues to mount every day, every time you look into this stuff, and this evidence suggests quite strongly that American history as we know it has been redacted, altered, and filled with misinformation for the sole purpose of hiding the truth about some major events from relatively recent history, as well as major catastrophic events from probably very ancient history, and ultimately hiding from us who we are and where we came from. Okay, but before we get into any of that speculation, let's just dig into a few more buildings from the 1800s and see if there's any other stinky fish. And we'll get out of California altogether. We'll go to Michigan. Incidentally, we don't have to do this with mental asylums, but it really seems as if these institutions were like the butter on the government's bread, man. I mean, this gets pretty crazy, right? So let's go to Michigan in the mid-1800s. Traverse City Hospital, built in 1881. This sprawling example of horse and buggy log cabin, this sprawling example of palatial estate palace was built as the third in the local area, housing overflow wackadoos from Kalamazoo and Pontiac, Michigan luxury palace asylums. To give you an idea of what type of overpopulation problems were brewing in Michigan during the 1800s, Traverse City Asylum, the 4,762 persons counted in Traverse City in the 1810 federal census were almost entirely confined to a narrow line of settlement extending north and south between Detroit and Maumee River along the eastern shore of Lake Erie and the Detroit River. What this means, what they're saying here in the census data, is that practically all of Michigan was basically unpopulated around 1810. Nobody lived there. 4,000 people in the entire state of Michigan. That's nothing. Okay? The population of the central area had increased from less than 1,000 in 1840 to nearly 7,000 in 1850, and the 21 counties constituting the northern area had scattered population of less than 2,000, including a settlement area in Grand Traverse region. So basically, nobody lives in Michigan in the early 1800s. Okay? So for Traverse City to open a sprawling and luxurious basket can seems a bit excessive for the times. When the hospital opened in 1885, there were, drumroll, 48 whole patients. I mean, look at this place. According to Wiki, this fabulous nut house resort became the city's largest employer, which is a bit of a shock. Traverse City Craytown basically got around any human rights problems by forcing their patients to work as practical slaves. The head shrinker got really greasy with his prognosis protocols, forcing his patients to work on the farm as part of their treatment. Ew. In his defense, he apparently banned straitjackets at his facility, but he didn't mind getting everyone else's hands dirty with some good old-fashioned slave labor. Pretty good hustle going on if you ask me. All legal, all very legal, and upstanding citizens and pillars of their community, right? But do we really need sprawling palatial castle estates to house all 48 wackadoos in Traverse City in 1800s? And maybe a couple overflows from Kalamazoo, of course, but Kalamazoo's population was a whopping 13,000 people according to the 1850 census. So moving on to Pontiac, Michigan, and these are all three right in a cluster, because remember, there's three of them. The reason they had three is the first one got too overpopulated, so they had to fill up Kalamazoo, and then Kalamazoo got too overpopulated, so they had to fill up the third one. Okay, so they're just literally overflowing with nutcases in a time when Michigan practically doesn't have anyone living there. Okay, and I guess the way that I read the numbers was a bit misleading. I gave you the population numbers for like 1800 to 1810. The 1850 numbers were a bit higher, but not by much. It's not like there was millions and millions of people living there. But anyway, the Pontiac Michigan Asylum, aka the Clinton Valley Center, was built to house all the extra wackadoos overflowing from Kalamazoo. Now, I can't seem to find any census data for Pontiac, Michigan in the mid-1800s, so I'm sure we can just assume that there were hundreds of millions of people living right there, if only to justify all the pimped-out Castle Asylum palaces being popped up all over the place, just overflowing with patients, right? I mean, surely there's millions and millions of people living in Pontiac, Michigan. I mean, probably not, but maybe then I could just stop making this video if that were the case, right? Anyway, so it seems absurd that one of the first projects many small towns across the United States broke ground on before they were even really towns were indeed allegedly mental hospitals that look like Bruce Wayne's winter house. Okay, for whatever it's worth, the Oakland County Jail, Oakland, Michigan, wasn't even built until 1973. Kalamazoo Jail was built in 1971, and the Grand Traverse County Jail was built in 1964 with a current max capacity of just 190 inmates. To put this in perspective, apparently people who lived in Michigan in the mid-1800s were beyond the normal spectrum of crazy people per capita. I mean, off the fucking charts, really. I mean, the relatively modern Traverse County Jail currently holds less than 200 people max, but their mental asylum popped off with 48 patients on day one back in 1885. To me, this makes zero sense, as you would expect the population of the modern jailhouse to absolutely dwarf the antiquated population of the old hospital. But no, not at all. Not even close. So the question becomes, was something making everyone in Michigan lose their damn minds? Or is something going on here? Something else? Like, what is this? So I would submit there's definitely something else going on, but we just don't know exactly what that is. What is clear is the fact that something is up with all the ornate, fabulous, luxurious loony bins, which all started popping up in America in the mid-1800s. Some of these buildings seem to just magically appear the very year the town is founded, before they build any schools, before they build any stores, or even pave the roads. They tend to throw up their magnificent mental hospitals post-haste. Hell, in all three cases in the Michigan state that we just checked, the area housing these asylums didn't even build a jailhouse until like 100 years later. I mean, honestly, I don't understand how you can have a small town in Michigan filled with so many crazy people, yet not a single jail cell appears to have been needed locally until the 1970s. It's worth mentioning that the Pontiac Asylum opened in 1878 with a whopping 221 patients the day they opened, who were literally overflowing from Kalamazoo's madhouse. So the modern jailhouse in Pontiac, Michigan currently holds less inmates than just the overflow mental patients from Pontiac Asylum when they opened in the 1800s. Now, if that doesn't get you scratching your head a bit, I don't know what will. So, these are just a few examples of asylums which can be found all over this country in practically every city, certainly in every state, which were apparently the top priority for fledgling cities with hardly any residents to speak of. I mean, really, how can you have such a high demand for luxurious, lavish mental institutions when nobody even lives in the greater region at all? Not only were these ballin'-ass fruitcake baskets the top priority for fledgling cities without any infrastructure or people, but they honestly spared no expense when it came to applying the horse and buggy version of bling-bling on their proverbial asylum grills. With experience building modern hospitals and schools, again, I know they're built as cost-effectively and as quickly as possible, even though it takes years and years and costs millions and millions of dollars. Every expense is spared in the modern terms when possible, and then every expense that is spared when possible is then pocketed by the general contractor, of course. But if you were to propose a plan for some fabulous, ornate castle as, say, a 200-room mental hospital this day and age, they would literally laugh you out of the room. When you told them that your budget was $15 million, they'd likely flatten you with a steamroller, and honestly, at that point, you probably wouldn't even be able to tell them about the hewn stone walls you planned on putting in there, right? Modern hospitals and schools are never anything but functional, certainly not aesthetically pleasing, certainly not elaborately decorated. There is zero attention paid to jazzing up the architecture with ornate designs and towers and vaulted ceilings and hewn stone walls. Vaulted Gothic towers will almost never be found on modern buildings of similar purpose, right? Almost never. I'll just come out and say it. Never. You're not going to have any Gothic vaulted towers on modern day built hospitals. So I suppose that we might conclude that the mid-1800s were officially the era of enterprising asylum magnates building lavish mental hospitals in the middle of nowhere for a population barely deserving of a red light, and built to such grand and astonishing standards as we see in these few cases here and in many, many others, which these are just typical examples. This is typical stuff here. Okay. Now, according to an article that I found at clemson.edu, there were 109 asylums constructed in the United States between 1835 and 1900, 41 of which are considered to be sites of historical significance. And, I'm definitely not going to look at all 109 of these, but does that seem a bit excessive? I mean, that's over 2 a state over the course of less than 100 years. But, honestly, when you start researching these things, man, they were able to throw these, allegedly able to throw these gargantuan castles up in like a couple years, sometimes even just as short as a year. So, that's just, I don't know, man, it's crazy, but okay. Anyways, when we typically think of 1800s construction as a modern person, we tend to conjure images of log cabins and, wood frame saloons and modest cabins with tar roofing and that sort of thing. Again, this sort of construction is practical from the standpoint, from every standpoint, to the standpoint of design, prepping materials, and construction, and throughout our upbringing, we're sort of conditioned to believe that fancy castle estates were probably not being thrown up all willy-nilly all over the damn place by some cowboys with handlebar mustaches in the 1800s. However, that's exactly what we're expected to believe was happening here. Exactly that. People were just throwing up castle asylums willy-nilly all over the place. Okay? Now, we're expected to believe that during the 1800s, while Abraham Lincoln was just an honest little beard, ruining his eyes by reading by candlelight in his one-room log cabin, the head shrinkers in Pontiac, Michigan were spending $448,000 on their brand-new luxury palatial resort insane asylum and fruitcake basket. Adjusted for inflation, the cost of this definite panty wetter would be about $15 million today, if you can even believe it. It must be noted that this is practically nothing for a building of this quality and grandeur. Okay, a few years ago, I worked on an elementary school. The cost of it was $28 million for the school. Honestly, it wasn't even that big of a school, even as elementary schools go, and it certainly wasn't no asylum for the criminally insane, if you know what I mean. So to build a generic-ass school as cheaply as possible, it cost professional, modern builders about double what the horse and buggy troglodytes were throwing up in like a year or two, like a layup, using nothing but the finest styles, materials, and just overall pimpology of their worksite. Either the builders of the 1800s were just way better than we are today, without any technology or supply chains or skilled labor availability or the national highway system or laser levels or plastic in general or power tools, and on and on and on. Either that or something else is going on here. What did these old-timers have that we're missing? Honestly, I'd like to find a contractor who could build similar asylums so quickly for under $15 million just on the drop of a hat. We would be rich because that's like a $250 million project. In realistic terms today, it's going to cost you hundreds of millions of dollars to build something like that. So what secrets did these old-timers of the 1800s have up their sleeves? Again, one alternative, which looks better and better each time I see this sort of glitch in the historical matrix, is the possibility that these asylums weren't built in the 1800s by semi-skilled immigrants at all. In my opinion, it makes a lot more sense that whomever was given special privileges by the psychopathic parasites in power to commandeer these pre-existing castles were set up as psychiatrists, overseeing all the many crazy people in the 1800s who were just like, the rate of being crazy in the 1800s, it was like a pandemic, right? But perhaps these patients were being held there against their will for a variety of possible reasons. Least of which could be things like gold discoveries, or maybe your old lady, you want to trade her in on a new one, so you just sign her in to the doctor. I mean, you hear stories, man. It seemed like it was pretty easy to do back then. Anyway, at least the treatments of these asylums appeared to work, since they apparently cured all those damn crazy people at some point after 1900, because really it seems like all the crazy people were concentrated in Michigan in 1800. But Luckily, we only had to start building local jailhouses in the 1960s, right? So what a priority these grandiose asylums had over even building local jails. Think about that for 10 seconds. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on PayPal or Patreon. I'll put the links in the descriptions. Love y'all, God bless, and see you in the next one. Man.